Hello and welcome, I'm Sarah Payne and this is a short or relatively short video on securing a Ubuntu server. It is aimed at people that are new to Ubuntu server. It is not a comprehensive guide on server security. It is more something that many people would consider to be a bare minimum to feel like they have a secure system. The guide is part of a longer guide into setting up and maintaining Opensimulator on Ubuntu server and under Windows. Okay, so let's get started. When you first get a server from a hosting company, they will provide you with a root password and a login IP address, so that's the norm. And this picks up from where I've left off in a previous video installing Opensimulator server. So we're going to start by SSH root, then put in the IP address of your server. Okay. This is just a note here about some of the tools. I'm using terminal or console in this case because I'm working on Linux. You could equally as well use PowerShell if you were using Windows. We've just done the SSH root section. And the first thing we need to do is actually update the root password, because we don't want to leave the root password as it was sent here or first displayed to you, because that is a security risk. So having done that, we can start moving on, and we're going to create a different account to work with, because you shouldn't realistically be working with the root account under normal circumstances. That should be reserved for an emergency situation. So we're going to add another user. Because this guide is aimed at setting up for Opensimulator, we're going to create a user called Opensim. You can enter details here if you wish to, but there's no requirement to. And the next thing we're going to do is give that user sudo permissions. Under Ubuntu, the way you do that is by adding them to the sudo as group. Okay, so that done, we're actually going to now change the port that we use to connect to the server, but I'm going to open a second terminal window here because we will need two in a moment. And this is just so you can maintain a connection while you test some of the bits that you're changing. But so the very first test that we're going to do, so let me zoom in a bit so it's a bit easier for you to read on the video. Okay, so that's working, so we can log in now using our new user account. Okay, so next thing you need to do is find a free port. Now if this is a new machine, most of them should be free. However, to check it, we can just and to explain that command, it's telling us to look for a load of connections that specify just listen. So let me zoom out that bit. So there we go. And we can see that the only port that is being listened to in here is port 22. So at the moment, this machine being brand new has a virtual open scope for port choice. So we could choose any value from 1000 up to 99999. There are some well-known ones you might want to avoid. For the purpose of the guide, we're just going to use 2789. So before we can update that, we do need to allow that through the firewall. Sudo ufw allow 2789/TCP. In actual fact, we don't even need to be using the root account at this point. We can close that altogether. Okay, so that's added the rule to the firewall. And the next thing we're going to do is edit the SSH config. Now there are two ways. We can either do it directly from this point here, as in this command line, or you could navigate to it. And we can see the same file, the SSH config, or the SSHD config rather, is here. And that's exactly the same thing. It brings us to exactly the same place. And what we're looking at is this first line, the port 22. Scroll down using cursor keys, delete, and we're going to change that to 2789. Control and O, and then hit the enter key. Control and X to exit. And this is where we're going to want to have a second window to test it. So we're now going to do sudo systemctl restart SSH. And now, if I do the same line that we used last time to connect, it should refuse us. But if I add -p2789, we get the same password choice. The reason we left this window open here was it was still connected, so if it was for some reason not working as expected, we could have reverted our change without losing connection to the server. Okay, so the next stage is to enable the UFW firewall. You don't need to forward to your home directory, I'm just doing it so it's clean. Right, so sudo UFW enable, Ask if you, let's just zoom out so you can read that on a single line. Asking if we want to disrupt connections. But we've already added the rule previously, so we know it's not going to be an issue. So we can hit yes. And then we need to disable port 22. And to do that, we can just delete the actual port itself as in here. So sudo fw delete allow 22/TCP. Oh, because generally what you find is that in the hosted systems, SSH is already pre-configured on the firewall because it's required for them to give out services to customers. Because this was a fresh service I set up, that port had never actually been added to the firewall in the first place because the firewall wasn't actually enabled up until now. So anything could connect on any port. Now it can exclusively only accept connections on port 2789. So the next thing we need to do is change this so that we don't have to use a password. It is instead using a keygen. So I'm going to exit here. So this is on your local machine now, not on the server. We add the -B just to make it a very strong key that we're creating. Now I am going to choose a different location now because I've already created a key that I'm using and I don't want to overwrite it. But typically you would just hit enter at this point. You can add a passphrase if you like, but it is generally problematic to do so, or it can be in some situations, and there's really no need for it. So that's generated a key phrase. Now this is where Linux users and Windows users deviate slightly. Users that are running on Linux will do SSH copy ID. You need to add in your new port number, which is 2789. Add in the username and then the IP address. Did I type that wrong? Oh, yes I did. So we'll ask you for the password. Okay, but if we come down here, exit from here now, and then do the same again, it connects without a password because it's taken the key file that we've copied to the server and it's authenticating against that key file that we created. And if you bear with me for just a moment, I will actually show you what one of these key files looks like. fact I'm not going to, because that's rather a security risk, and I deliberately didn't actually save the other key a moment ago. Give me a second. Because doing it now, I can just delete this file afterwards and never use it. You can see this is basically what your password is now. That's what somebody would have to try and crack if they were going to try and work out your password, and you can imagine how many combinations would be in that. Windows users have a slightly different command to do, but it does exactly the same thing. It takes the contents of your public key from your local machine and puts it into the known users file or the authorized keys file on the remote machine. Ooh, no. Did I not copy that correctly? Two 789. Users Opensim. And there we go. If I hadn't already just passed the other key in, it would have asked me for the password at this point. But both of those commands do exactly the same thing. The only difference is that the copy ID will not work on Windows, whereas the cat will. The cat will also work on Linux. So we've already done that, we've tested the authentication. Now the next thing we need to do is turn off password authentication, because we don't want to really allow that. So we're going to go back into our SSH config file. I'm logged in on this window, aren't I? Right, okay. Sudo now. This time what we're looking for is a permit root login, yes, possibility change, and the password authentication. That one needs changing to no. Consider turning off root login authentication as well, although there are times you may require that. That could be hashed out like that, in fact it likely will be. Let's change that to no, Control O, enter, Control and X to quit. And then we need to restart the server. What that has done is it means that when we were first connecting, because there was no key file in place, it was giving the option to connect with a password. That option is now removed. If they do not have a key file, it will not authenticate the login. One of the last little bits that we need to do is set up fail to ban. Fail to ban is significantly more important if you have password authentication, which I do not recommend, but it can still further strengthen the security even with a key file. What it does is, after a certain number of authentication attempts made, it will actually use the firewall to ban the machine trying to make the connection. So not only do we have a key that would take a very, very long time for somebody to actually try and work out, but additionally we're going to actually stop them connecting to the server in a moment after every third failed attempt. So it would take them forever and a lot of machines. So let me close that window because we don't need two windows open now. Yes, I have. Thought I had. So sudo. No, it doesn't actually need to be apt-get. Apt-get will still work, but you just need sudo apt install fail to ban. Then we need to start and enable it once it's finished installing. Enabling it means that when you next restart the server, it will automatically restart with the server. Okay, so now we're going to set up a configuration file for it. We're back to our trusty old Nano. And you can copy paste this or type it out, it doesn't matter. Now you will notice that says port 22. Of course we're not using port 22, we're using port 2789, so you do need to change that. You can have maximum retry or whatever you like, but realistically when it's a key file, it should authenticate first time every time, because you're not typing it in, there's not going to be a typing mistake. I tend to just leave it at 3. And now we need to restart the service. And that's it. The server is now predominantly secure. We've got root login disabled. No, we didn't actually disable that. We could go back and do that. But we have password login disabled. We have key file authentication enabled. We have a strong key file. We have the firewall enabled. And we have it accepting just the one port that we have at the moment. So everything else that we want to be able to connect to the server, we will need to make specific firewall rules to allow. Right, and that's this particular task complete. Thank you for watching. See you in the next video.